Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic for you today. Let's do it. What's the scariest fact you know about World War II? Please remember to like, share, hype, listen, and ask for shoutouts, and subscribe. The Battle of Stalingrad was a black hole of death. When combining both sides, it was an average of about 10,000 casualties per day. That's an entire town every day for 200 days straight. The one that always freaked me out is how entire towns in Europe would just vanish overnight during evacuations or retreats. Like one day, it's a normal community, the next day it's abandoned and silent. Something about that emptiness feels so eerie. The fate of the sailors of the USS Indianapolis in July of 1945. In July 1945, Indianapolis completed a top-secret, high-speed trip to deliver uranium and other components for Little Boy, the first nuclear weapon used in combat, to the Tinian Naval Base, and subsequently departed for the Philippines on training duty. At 0:15 on July 30th, the ship was torpedoed by the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-58 and sank in 12 minutes. Of 1,195 crewmen aboard, about 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 890 faced exposure, dehydration, saltwater poisoning, and shark attacks while stranded in the open ocean with few lifeboats and almost no food or water. The Navy learned of the sinking 4 days later, when survivors were spotted by the crew of a PV-1 Ventura on a routine patrol. A U.S. Navy PBY flying boat crew landed to save those in the water. Only 316 survived. No U.S. warship sunk at sea has lost more sailors. More chilling instead of scary. There was a difference, with a few notable exceptions, between the Nazis' concentration camps and extermination camps. The extermination camps were mostly a function of Actian Reinhardt, the liquidation of the Jewish ghettos in occupied Poland. Those facilities operated from 42 to 43. The reason that they stopped operating wasn't because of resources constraints or wartime misfortune for Germany. They stopped operating because they'd accomplished their task. The ghettos were empty. They didn't have any more people to kill. Leftovers, e.g. Hungary's Jews, were sent to Auschwitz, which operated as a partial extermination facility, partial concentration/slave labor camp. Often the Holocaust is presented at a macro level, and rightfully so, as a failed attempt to eradicate Ashkenazi Jews. But in my opinion, it's chilling to realize that in specific areas, specifically in the extermination camps that are widely known, it actually did succeed because they ran out of people to murder. The average life expectancy of a Red Army soldier that came to Stalingrad was about 24 hours. That number is misleading, though, as it includes the command and soldiers in forfeited backward positions. The average life expectancy of a Red Army soldier that came to Stalingrad to actually fight was way less than 24 hours. The Doolittle raid was the first feel-good battle that boosted morale after Pearl Harbor. Of the 16 planes that participated, 15 crashed. One that was captured when it landed in the Soviet Union. The signal to turn on the lights for the runways was never sent, so nobody could find the airport. Of the 80 airmen that participated, 3 were killed, 8 captured, 4 survived and were released after the war, but the death toll was substantially higher. The Imperial Japanese Army pursued the Doolittle raiders and tortured and killed anyone who was suspected of helping with the raid. Entire towns were burned to the ground, including Nanchang. In all, it estimated that 250,000 were killed as a direct result of China agreeing to allow the bombers to land, refuel, and fly to areas outside of Japanese control. Well, no shoutouts today, just some commentary on the idea of World War. Smedley Butler said it after World War I, that war is a racket. It's the only thing that is, the profit is counted in dollars and the losses are counted in blood. There was a way to see how the rich get richer, and you lead that to the Supreme Commander of the American forces in World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, who in his exit speech in 1961, when Kennedy was about to assume office, which you could definitely watch on YouTube, definitely mentioned it before, he coined the phrase military-industrial complex, which arguably is the exact reason why we have fought literally every single war since World War II, and some could argue even for World War II as well. So when the interests of business have influence over our country's military and politicians, the lines of what is truly a noble cause are very blurred. And I'm looking at the prospect now of American involvement in Venezuela and how American oil companies are looking to do that. It almost makes you feel like, is it about keeping fentanyl out where they don't even make fentanyl? Or is it about oil and profit? And I'm going on a rant here, but I don't do this often, so I'm sorry, but it's all rubbish. And there's no good cause. It's not about fentanyl. They don't even make it in Venezuela. It's a joke. And if you wanted to talk about drug smuggling, why wouldn't you do that to Mexico first if you really cared? Which you don't. Government. No one will see this. I did. And that's okay. But I want to put this down so the story exists on the internet. Not quite at scale to impact the world, but there was an incident that only 2 people noticed that, if turned out differently, would mean that I would not exist. My great-grandmother and her 6-year-old daughter, my grandma, evacuated from Kharkiv as the Nazis were approaching. They spent the next year moving east, trying to reunite with family. At one point they somehow got information that an uncle with his family evacuated south to Stalingrad. So they started to make their way there. They got there as the bombing started and the Nazis were approaching, and all civilians in the city were ordered to evacuate. The family that they were trying to find were already gone, or were never there to begin with. Most of the city was on the western bank of the Volga, and you had to take a ferry to get to the eastern bank. My great-grandmother dragged her daughter to the river, away from the buildings that were being bombed, and turned south to get to the port to get on the ferry. The riverbank was muddy, and my grandma's shoe was caught in the mud and slipped off. They spent a few precious seconds getting her shoe out of the mud and putting it back on. That by the time they got to the ferry terminal, the ferry had just left. As they watched it leave, a German dive bomber hit the ferry and it sank with almost everyone, with only a few people managing to swim to shore. After seeing this, they got on the next ferry and safely crossed. They ended up evacuating to Frunze, now Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. And that's the story of how a little girl's shoe that got stuck in a river mud is the reason I exist. By the way, Grandma is doing well. She celebrated her 90th birthday last week, surrounded by her great-grandkids. The Old Guard and the New Guard were fascist groups in Australia who got to very high levels of government and operated in secret with a plan to launch a coup. They only ended in World War II. One of the higher officials, Charles Spry, became the post-war hero of ASO, the Government Intelligence Service, until the 1960s. It's little known in Australia, but the damning material is in the National Archives and the War Memorial and the old records of the Commonwealth Security Service. The Usted scare the Academy. They were Croatian who sided with the Nazis and committed atrocities so disgusting, even the visiting German Nazi top brass had to tell them to calm down. According to reports, they would have huge concrete structures with a hole in the roof. They would set a huge fire in the structure, and then usher men, women, and children to jump through the hole. The trapped sailors of the USS West Virginia. When it sank at Pearl Harbor, 3 young sailors found an air pocket in a storeroom. They were trapped at the bottom of the harbor in pitch blackness and cold water. When the Navy finally salvaged the ship 6 months later, they found a calendar on the wall. The men had marked off 16 days before they finally ran out of air or succumbed. They were alive while their own fleet was being repaired right above their heads, and no one could get to them. Independent State of Croatia, Nazi puppet state, and crimes of the USS regime, which aimed to completely eradicate every single ethnic minority in Croatia. They essentially killed for sport, mostly using daggers and machete. Their most prominent weapon was a Serb cutter, designed to cut a person's throat in the fastest and most efficient way. They would even engage in killing competitions, some even killing up to 1,000 people in a single day. They mostly killed women, children, and elderly people. Even Hitler was absolutely appalled by the crimes of the USS regime. I worked with an expat married to a German woman. He said his father-in-law told the story that at the end of the war, when things were going poorly for Germany, the SS would drive from village to village in the countryside. They were conscripting young boys, saying, "If you're old enough to hold a shovel, you can hold a gun." Those who refused or were found hiding were shot. My great-grandfather's family and extended family did not come to America when he did prior to World War II began. The small town most of his family was from lived in a small town, which was along the railroad high, eventually led to Auschwitz. What? If the Nazis who transported Jews along that route saw a synagogue along that route, they would exit the train and armed murder, then set the towns on fire, and left everyone for dead. I remember the day he sat and told the entire family that he lost almost our entire lineage of family if one of those attacks by the Nazis. Our family, and least his side, were Greek, Russian, Orthodox religious people. There was no war engagement with their town, so the loss of life was not even accounted or written anywhere. Not until well after the wars had ended. These innocent people were slaughtered like animals and had no justice on their behalf. Their ages ranged from infants to elderly. The South African division was basically a bunch of kids who lied about their age and got sent up to fight against Rommel and Styx. My friend was one of them. He said it was ridiculous at the time, and they were too young to understand how serious it was. It was also ridiculously easy to break out of POW camps, because the guards were half pissed, and they only got in trouble when they stole villagers' bikes, and being sent to guard a bunch of teenagers was not seen as a serious job. Everyone wanted to get the hell out of the way of the Russians. The Brits left everyone behind in the Malay campaign, despite knowing the horrific conditions, and it took forever to repatriate them because they didn't want them back and they didn't give a shit about colonial forces. It's scary to me because it happened in my family. My mom's grandpa was fighting for the Soviets and escaped near death twice, saving half of my bloodline. The first time he went to get water for his group of soldiers, when he came back everyone was dead. Had anyone else gone to get water, he most likely would have died too, meaning basically everyone on my mom's side of the family would never exist. The second time, him and his group had to cross a minefield again. Everyone died except for him. These stories are the reasons World War II sits very close to me. By improbable luck, the USA had only 2 nuclear bombs available for that war and used them both. If the Manhattan Project had taken a few months longer, then the bombs wouldn't have been used in World War II when they were so weak and scarce. Instead, they'd have continued to build 100 nuclear bombs and later use them during the Korean War, demolishing huge portions of Asia. This has been proposed as one solution for the Fermi paradox. Most planets don't survive the invention of nuclear weapons because they build up a much stronger arsenal before first using them in battle. The Croatian Ustaš was aligned with the Nazis and modeled their ethnic cleansing on the final solution. As well as killing Jews and Roma, they wanted to remove the Serbian population from Croatia. 1/3 were to be converted from Orthodoxy to Catholicism, 1/3 to be deported, and 1/3 to be killed. Their methods of killing were so brutal that even the Nazis thought they went too far. There were many reports of appalled Nazi officials. The usual method was simply throwing their victims off cliffs. Others were sledgehammer blows to the head or being hacked apart by penknives. One Ustaš chaplain, Miroslav Filipović, was even court-martialed by the Nazis for his cruelty. A Jewish survivor of the camp where he was commander recalled him playing a game where two soldiers would throw a Serbian child into the air with the aim of impaling them on Filipovich's upheld dagger, taking bets on how many tries it would take. The Ustash had the support of the Catholic Church until it became clear the Allies would win the war, and Ustash symbols, revisionism, and support are still found in Croatia today. I read about two Serbian Nazis who walked into a town. A little toddler happily walked up to them. They killed him and skinned him in the street to intimidate the locals. I read it in an old book at a university library. It was so creepy to think how many old, almost forgotten stories were scattered throughout the thousands of books they had. And I just happened to open it at that page. My father-in-law fought at the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne. He recently died at 97. During the fighting, his feet froze, and when he relieved, he was sent home to a hospital. He didn't remember in what state he went. After his feet were healed or better, he was put in a ward with other soldiers. Each morning, all the soldiers were given a pill to take. The observers would watch them for reactions. He said some were screaming, hallucinating, or just zoned out. Others were acting normal. Double-blind testing of LSD. In the 90s, he contacted a congressman in Florida to see if he could find out what he had been given, as he developed paranoia during his time in the ward. He was told that it would be looked into with a promise to let him know. Next time he called the office, they denied ever having spoken to him and refused to have any more contact. This coincides with the reportations given to troops that were unwittingly exposed to high levels of radiation during nuclear testing. In the name of science and security, our government used our own troops as guinea pigs. My family comes from Boro in eastern Poland. That area has become a sort of capital for one of the underground partisan organizations called NSZ, Narodow Sili Zbroj, National Armed Forces, a nationalistic group with a lot of controversy. For example, the killing of unarmed communist fighters in '43, which is another event that Boro is known for. I believe they also had anti-Semitic views and committed crimes against civilians. My great-grandfather joined them when she was about 16 years old, patching up wounded, relaying messages, that kind of stuff. I like to believe she didn't join for ideological reasons, but just because they were there, and she was young and wanted to help against an occupier. Her family home was also sometimes used as a meeting place. My great-grandfather at the time was in the AK Armia Krajowa, Home Army, which was the most legitimate and largest organization. However, in this area of Poland it was rather small. Due to this, on February 2nd, 1944, the Nazis carried out the largest and brutal pacification in Polish territories of the war in Baro and the surrounding villages. The SS, Wehrmacht, German police, and some Ukrainian and Russian collaborators, Galishtashes SS, this was a force of 3,000 people with light artillery support and recon from planes. The villages were surrounded and set on fire. The perpetrators moved from home to home, killing indiscriminately. Some people were herded into buildings, which were then set on fire, or had grenades thrown into them, burning people alive. Ours, as well as bayoneting infants, along with just shooting, took place. From stories told to me by my great-grand-aunt, some people had their throats slit with knives and daggers, mainly by the volunteer Ukrainian SS. The estimated deaths range from 800 to 1,300 people, where around 400 to 600 were women and children. The villages were pretty much burned to the ground in their entirety. Some people were captured and matched to Goszlarodow or Budzin labor camp. Those who were slow during the march were shot. Unfortunately, not one person was brought to justice over these events. However, there was some in the aggressors' midst who helped people get away in the middle of this massacre. My great-grandaunt, who was a child, then remembered a German soldier letting them through the river and telling them where to hide. Another story I read about a girl being saved by maybe a Czech soldier in the German army who convinced others to let her go. Both my great-grandmother and great-grandfather's family somehow got through this. I believe my great-grandmother's dad was wounded by a bullet but survived. The partisans of NSZ during all this retreated and did not help the population. During the winter they would send people home and had a small number of fighters available. Although that does leave a bad impression when I think about all those people dying from helping them. After the Germans were pushed back by the Soviets, my great-grandparents left their organizations and were interrogated by the NKVD. It's very jarring to think about this, and of my family, which I luckily got to meet as a child, but back then I wasn't that interested in history and had no knowledge of anything happening there. The idyllic countryside, the beautiful river behind my great-grandparents' house, all those places where I would play, and all the elderly people around were witnesses to this horror. I recently watched a movie called Come and See, available on YouTube English subtitles, which I recommend as a very tough, haunting watch that shows how some of the atrocities look like and what toll it had on ordinary people. The film takes place in Belarus. It reminded me of the events of the Borough, inspired me to comment and provide a visual that can be hard to imagine where just reading. It's sad to me that far right-wing politics are so prevalent today, using hatred for their gain, especially in Poland. The fear-mongering and the hatred towards Germans and Ukrainians is being used by the far right. They talk about what happened in the Second World War as justification why we shouldn't be helping Ukraine. And I, as someone whose family was affected and went through the things I wrote above, that argument makes absolutely no sense. The sins of our fathers are not our sins. I love my German and Ukrainian brothers and sisters no matter what happened in the past. We can remember the past, remember the victims, and learn. I'm just going to reread that last one from the sins of our fathers. The sins of our fathers are not our sins. I love my German and Ukrainian brothers and sisters no matter what happened in the past. We can remember the past, remember the victims, and learn from it while building the future together.